And so that's what's important. I think we live in a day and age now where everything is data driven. And what does that really mean? Like data driven means that you get better educated answers. It's not a dangerous thing. I know it's like, oh, they're selling your data. Like, what does that mean? Well, they're trying to find out what you like. So in the golf side of things, we're trying to find out what your best self is. And that's what the data is. The data is authentically finding out what your best self is. And if it's not there, let's get you there. And let's get you there quicker than later.
Welcome, everybody. We expect this to be a full house. Thank you, everybody, for making time on a Monday morning. Very, very excited to cover this topic and the presentation with our ambassador, Dana Dahlquist. We're also joined by other team members from Sportsbox, as well as Tim Brand from Foresight Sports, Dr. Phil Cheatham, our Chief Science Officer, Nate Ashton, Director of Sports Science, and Paul Park, our VP of Business Operations, aka the Swing Ninja. There were some funny comments during the US Open on social media. But yeah, super, super exciting topic and really educational material that we're about to present today. I hope you guys are all very excited. Tim, do you want to say a couple words before we get started with the meat of the presentation?
Thanks everybody for taking the time, and thank you especially to Dana. Obviously, everybody's schedules are very busy, but we're really excited to launch the partnership and looking forward to the webinar. So thanks everybody.
While we wait for everybody to join, I'll just give the premise of what we're going to present. First, Dana Dahlquist has been a Sportsbox ambassador for a couple years, has been using the products in all of his lessons. Obviously, if you guys are in the room, you already know that Dana has been working with Bryson on his swing for the past year and a few months, I think just before the PGA Championship last year. And recently, when I let Dana know the insider scoop on what we were working on with Foresight Sports and integrating the product so that you can get all of the data in one place on Sportsbox, he immediately, jumped at the chance to do some work with Bryson, who we all know is a very data-driven, data-motivated player. So, what we're going to present is the work that we did together that helped lead him to winning the US Open this year. And hopefully you guys will take away, some learnings about the use of the data and use of the combined data and the power that could be unlocked by analyzing these two sets of data, or I should say 3 sets of data, ball, club, and body data all in one place. I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the true power of understanding the combined data for coaching and training. So that's kind of the premise of what we're going to present. We'll get started. But quick housekeeping things. Someone's already dropped a question in the Q&A. That's how we can interact with you. Please drop any questions in the Q&A section or the feature in Zoom. Dana, I'll probably interrupt along the way to pepper along with these questions, but if we don't get to them, we'll address them offline over social media content or something else. So, but yeah, questions are always welcome. All right, we'll get started. All right, so before we get to the meat of the presentation, I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce Sportsbox because some of you may not be very familiar and kind of the work we're doing together in partnership with Foresight Sports. So, I always start like this because to talk about why we do what we do, because I think it illustrates our purpose really well. Would you rather analyze ball flight like this with just looking at it, or with data, with accurate data, I should say? The answer is obviously you would want to use the data to exactly understand what's happening to the ball and the club. And so, with Sportsbox is very, very deeply aligned in this mission. We want to measure the things that cause us to hit the ball one way or another. And so, the question to you is, why would you analyze a golf swing with just video when you can analyze it with measurements and data? And people get hung up in 3D because it sounds really fancy and sounds like biomechanics and scientific. It's not, it's just measurements. You don't have to be a physicist to analyze ball flight data. And just the same, you don't have to be a biomechanist like Phil or Nate in order to analyze the golf swing, the motion with data. And what we do is to provide the products in order for you to do that easily and accessibly wherever you are, whether you are in a indoor range, outdoor range, or on the golf course, wherever you're swinging the club, you should be able to get that data in order for you to understand truly what's happening with the swing. And so, yeah, basically what we do is allow you to take a video with your phone or now in a studio format through one of our cameras, get 3D visual of that golf swing through our avatar that you can view from face on or down the line or above, wherever, full rotation of the avatar, even if you just took that swing video from one angle, and then get all the key biomechanical measurements on that swing. And we have a suite of coaching and training features built on the ability to capture the data for you to utilize as a coach or as a player. And as most of you guys now know, we have a partnership product with Foresight Sports, where you can pull data from any Foresight Sports device, whether it's a quad or a GC3 or Falcon, whatever device you have access to, you can link it to your Sportsbox app and get all of that data in the same place that you're getting Sportsbox data. So now that that's out of the way, we can now start with the meat of the presentation. And I'll say, I mentioned, I talked to Dana the moment we were very close to launching this integrated product. And we had an exciting discussion about the work that could be done with Bryson. And when we brought this to Bryson, they immediately had two problems or questions that they wanted to solve with data. Dana, what do you want to speak to those two things and why they were important to solve?
Yeah, so hey everybody, hope everybody's having a great morning. So with and this is not just exclusive just to Bryson. I think Bryson's the most willing guinea pig, to say the least. And because of the level of capacity of practice and how tight he wants his tolerances, it's interesting because GA and I have discussed for over a long extended period of time that 2D is very subjective and it has a lot to do with camera angles, and on the other side of it also preferences. So when we have players and students that come to us and want to improve and then get their tolerances of ball flight to be predictable, which I think is the number one thing that a tour player is looking for, we can't do it unless we have a long data set. So does that data set mean standing on the range for an hour and hitting a bunch of 7-irons and starting them in a certain direction, curving them back, and then leaving with a whole level of trust? I think that's the big part, is do they leave with a bunch of trust? And 99.9% of the time, it's like, okay, yes, I trust my current feel, but I'm just waiting for it to blow up. So that's kind of the big one, is we're trying to get a situation where okay, this was a good shot, this was a good measurement, and then this was an okay shot, here's another measurement. And then the big key with data is looking at the long haul. So we stretch this out obviously over the course of prior to Houston, to the US Open, and throughout the week. And we're able to kind of see where the numbers kind of flow. And to be honest, like a lot of the bends, tilts, and turns subjectively changed depending upon how the body was feeling, what the conditions were looking like. And then we can kind of look at those subsets and look at, hey, on this particular day where you hit at your best, this is where the numbers fell. And I don't mean to be jumping ahead at all, but I think this is important to understand that this is really like making things easier in the long run. So it might sound like it's pretty cumbersome up front, but it's really not. What it does is it allows the player in the long haul to eliminate the amount of time work and trying to find what they're looking for. So in Bryson's case, his miss that he doesn't want, and there's particular one, is his intentions to draw the ball. What happens when he starts it right and it does draw back to the target, or when it starts to right and it does not? And if any of them have a spin axis that's slightly right, what are the differences and what are the changes? And that's really what we set out to do, and then also find out what his best was. So I think that's where we kind of tailor what numbers actually fell into that occasion.
Yeah, I think I jumped straight ahead to this like this part of the presentation, but I'm sure a lot of people on the webinar are curious, what's been the evolution of the last year or so working together?
Mm.
What's he when you started working together, how was he hitting it? What were you guys trying to accomplish together in his swing? And then, through peak moments like Greenbrier last year, like what was that cycle like?
Yeah, so I think what we need to understand, and it's not just individual to Bryson. So every PGA Tour player, we could say has traits, and those traits might be, we could say that one guy's a centered player, one guy is not, or however you want to kind of parlay the modeling of a golf swing, which there are, but in many respects, like those modelings that we use in 2D are a little bit archaic. So, with Bryson, him being kind of a centered looking pivot player that hits a draw, we're looking at some particulars of where his turns, where his tilts are, how his setup would be, and where his intended swing direction goes. And I think at the end of the day, he operates in his best when he can release freely through the golf club and hit his draw. Now, I don't need to go into the defining of what releasing means, and that could be a long conversation. But to him, it feels like there's no manipulation, so it frees up, and that's really his best self. And it's interesting because when things are 1 degree to 1.5 degrees off in certain areas, at his amount of speed, that can, distally out in the 300 plus range, can be a lot. And so those tolerances need to be defined. And so if I push him too much in one direction by 2 degrees or three, then it moves the ball the other way. And if it's not enough, then the ball goes another way. So it's nice to have some defining points where he can attach what those feels are. So I think that's really where I see the future of this goes, because we're getting better and better performance players, and we need to know where their best self lies.
Yeah, and we've got a question that kind of relates to what I want to ask. Dana, I know a lot of teachers suggest keeping path 2 degrees either way, within 2 degrees either way. What are Bryson's path numbers with the driver and then with 7-iron? And I guess just kind of piggybacking off of that, he's got a Foresight GZ quad on every swing he takes. I don't think I've ever seen him take a swing other than in championship, tournament conditions without some in front of him. What is he looking for?
Yeah, so Bryson's driver, I would say swing direction is between 5 and 6 to the right. Angle of attack is between 2 and 3 up to the right. And a lot of this is defined also by his club, because he plays a low lofted driver. He hits up and out on it, and his spin rate's around 2,500. So like he has everything kind of metrically set to do that. Pretty similar. I mean, when you look at Rory McIlroy, he's another good driver of the ball. I asked Rory a couple years ago. His angle of attack is a little bit more. He's around 4 on course, sometimes 5. And hits it pretty straight to a draw, swing direction similar. So things start to blow up when things get too close to zero. So we try to keep that, particularly with a driver, in that same regard.
Yeah, and then as it relates to what we're about to present, I think he was particularly interested in spin axis number, especially with the driver, because as you said, things start blowing up if things get too close to zero. I think that's the same for his spin axis, right? He likes to see a negative number for that.
Yeah,
so that
somewhere between 3 and 5, maybe 6, but 6 is fine. I think the big part is as long as the start line is good and then the dependent curve is similar.
Yeah. So bringing it back to these two questions, after what we just talked about, basically, what do I do when I block it out to the right? Turn that into data speak, where we're trying to optimize for a negative spin axis, right? And you guys wanted the answer to what does the body do? What does the swing do when the spin axis starts getting too close to zero or even positive? So that really defined the problem clearly in a way that we can answer with data. So I'll jump to the next question, next slide here. So that first question we wanted to answer with the correlation analysis. And so, Paul and we flew down to Dallas and captured a lot of his swings in his home course, like in his comfortable environment, if you will, on the range. And then went down to Houston, captured more swings on the range, as you see here. And we followed him for on the golf course to capture swings on the golf course. And every swing we were capturing Foresight GC Quad data, as you are seeing here. And so with that, we came to Dana with our analysis, and the initial results were, if you could imagine, just a giant table, giant Excel file with lots and lots of swings and rows, columns and columns of data. And we have, besides the things that you already see in the app, we have a whole bunch of data that we don't show that we are calculating and analyzing on the back end. We have about 200 items that we measure in Sportsbox. And so we stacked all of the Foresight Sports GC Quad data, and we were particularly interested in the spin axis data, and then everything on every swing that we measure on Sportsbox side. So from there, Phil and Nate were able to do a correlation analysis to see which of our data points were the highest correlated with the positive spin axis. Nate, do you want to talk through some of the items and what kind of correlation coefficients you're seeing?
Yeah, so going through all of Bryson's data, like Jihei just said, we kept our independent variable as spin axis. So, and that was looking at a range of positive spin axis for Bryson to, I think, +2 or 3, even looking at the range down to -10, which could have been like a purposeful toe hit, during some of his range sessions. And if people like to follow him on YouTube, he even talks about it, and his warm-up sessions, he likes to hit one heel, one toe, just to show that he can do it and feel what happens with the ball, right? And then come back to center. So, as we went through looking at spin axis, we correlated that to every other variable, like Jihei just said. And if you go to the next slide, Jihei, if you want to talk about some of that, we were able to look through some of this data and get an idea through the correlations, look at how strong a correlation may be for a dependent variable, as well as look at the coefficient of determination. So that's the R² value. That gives us the idea of kind of what percent of variance, for that variable, is causing the spin axis, if you will, in this case. So, some of the highest correlated things, one of the first that we have up here was looking at chest bend at address for Bryson. And as you're seeing a scatter plot here, if we're looking at the vertical axis, that's spin axis. So it starts at -10. So that's left spinning ball all the way to +4. So that's a right spin. And then we have chest bend at address down at the bottom on the horizontal axis, and that ranges from right there about 28 degrees to about 42 degrees. And we can see our trend line moves positive direction, moving from left to right. So what that tells us is that the more chest bend at address that Bryson had through this analysis, the more likelihood that he had a right spin axis. So this was being able to see that on the scatter plot like this, it stuck out to us pretty drastically. So, and Dana, if you want to like kind of jump in here on at least this first variable that we saw some of the information on.
No,
So
you're doing
sorry,
great. You're doing great.
yeah, I'll talk through everything that we found and then like what Dana decided were most important to communicate to Bryson. So we actually had, 12 to 15 variables that seemed pretty highly correlated, including things like, things that happen, after impact, how much rotation he has at finish, for example, or how he has released it. There are variables around that. But what Dana wanted to focus on were things that basically what he can control, earlier in the swing that were more root cause than like the resultant. And so these four things that I am about to show you through these graphical kind of scatter plots were the things that, Dana determined were the most important for Bryson to focus on, which are, again, chest bend at address, pelvis sway at top, sway gap at top, and then pelvis lift at impact. So now let me turn it over to Dana to talk through some of these and what does this mean for the golf swing? We're looking at a bunch of data sets, but what does it mean for Bryson when he does push it out to the right? What did that movement look like?
Yeah. So in this particular graph here, we'll get chest bend, which is like forward bend at address. So the more bent over he is, the less the ball wants to draw, and the more the spin axis will go to the right. Now, that could mean, and this is another thing that we looked at, is that the knee flex changes, so the legs actually lose flex. So that's another data point. But regardless, if we just looked at this graph, the more that he was bent over, that's going to change his range of motion or turn to the right. And this is kind of the delivery of message that I would give a player. So the more you're bent over, the more left bend you're going to have. And the more left bend you're going to have, the less rotation to the right you're going to have through your rib cage. Doesn't mean your arms can't go deeper depending on the player, but in Bryson's case, he doesn't do that. He's a long hitter, so he can't just rip his arms back. And so the less rotation to the right, the less room he has for his left arm to work more from the inside. So from a coaching perspective, and I think this is my later self talking, I would try to eliminate as many steps as possible in order to get to the end result. So golf's hard enough. So if we can kind of eliminate, later steps to try to monitor, the better the outcome is going to be, especially under performance. So in Bryson's case, it was monitoring how much forward bend he had or chest bend at address, and then being able to display that in this correlation aspect of seeing that we can keep the tolerances of spin axis, let's say at negative, 2 to 4, then his forward bend is in a proper location. So that was really the first one. And then Jihei, the second one, which,
Second one is like kind of a cluster, right? The sway, pelvis sway at top and then sway gap at top, like they were related to each other.
100%. Yeah. So sway gap is kind of an interesting one because it's not necessarily side bend at address or right side bend. It's kind of like globally where the upper center is to the lower center. So when we look at 3D and we look at the rib cage and the pelvis, it's the geometric center points. So this is the problem with 2D is when we start drawing lines on the center of the body to the pelvis, it's very subjective, and or people putting sensors on the body, it's very subjective because it depends on where you put that center. And and if Phil wants to slap me at some point, like one of the advantages that Sportsbox has is it shows where that geometric center is. And so it's really important because if Bryson didn't have enough sway gap, you can see on the correlation where it was, let's say 1.8 relative to 2.2, that 2.2 to 2.4 range is actually kind of nice. And obviously the more he gets where it's too far back, he might start over curving it. And so we saw a really big data point here where it's like, okay, that's kind of at the end of the golf swing. So this isn't really a manual thing. It's a little bit of a setup thing and a little bit of a feel of a transitional thing. And this is particular for the driver because he wants these numbers to be somewhat tight and very dependable. And this is one of those data points you really can't see on 2D. It gets to be very subjective. You might see the result of it downstream, but that might be manufactured too late in the golf swing. So this was a really big one, and it really showed up, especially Jihei on Thursday. Thursday was a really good aspect because he hit over 80% of his fairways that day.
Yeah. So for those of you who are new to this terminology of sway gap, you can think of it as the distance between I know this isn't the correct terminology biomechanically, but you think about the center of mass of the pelvis segment and the center of mass of the chest segment, the horizontal distance between those. If you were to draw like a spike through the center of the chest segment, center of the pelvis segment, and you just drew a spike through those, and you were able to measure in inches with the distance between the gap between those, that's what sway gap means. So in this graph, what you're seeing is that the further apart, so further behind the chest is versus the pelvis at the top of the backswing, the more negative spin axis you could create. And conversely, the closer, more stacked the chest is over the pelvis, the center pelvis, the more right spin axis he was creating is what this says. So in golf speak, you can kind of say like getting behind the ball. I don't know what the right way to say that is, but that was one of the things. And then related to it was this pelvis sway, the center of the pelvis positioning at the top also.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing because is this done through setup or is this done through motion? And it's a little bit of a correlation of both because case in point, if we go back to the first slide, no pun intended, the golf swings where he hit it to the right, he was too bent over. He had to artificially create a potential look of side bend and pelvis sway. And that became, not good, or those are not that he did that because he didn't, but those potentially curved too much, either over curved to the left or went out to the right. So having the right, formula here of having the right chest bend and address, the causation of him being able to turn just slightly a little more to the right and not being too stacked up allowed him to have proper downswing mechanics. And then furthermore, if we go to pelvis lift, this is kind of the interesting thing. The pelvis lift, like how much and how little started to become a correlation relative to his lift. And so you can see kind of the cluster spot where it was like -2 to 4, how much lift it impacts. So when we start seeing like early extension of the pelvis or lack of it, we start seeing the ball starts to curve offline. And once again, very reactive. We want to see some pelvic lift, but we don't want to see obviously, too much too early. Just right at that impact interval, we want to be able to get that data point. And this is an interesting one because Bryson likes feeling vertical force. So that's his input. He likes to feel like he's pushing off his left side. So if there's too much slide, he can't get the push to go. And if he is too on top of it and he just starts spinning, that's where he can have issues as well. So it's kind of like a nice one. I call it the 1, 2, 3 punch, essentially. Especially during the week, it was kind of like getting 1, 2, 3 to happen. And that freed him up to allow his motor control to kind of become more adherent to freeing up his arms and allowing him to feel what he wants to feel. And by the way, he's a very hands and arms player. Like he likes to feel things through the hands because that's kind of a good reaction that his body's in the right place.
Yeah. Super interesting stuff. So I'm gonna move on to the second part where, you know, we were trying to solve for what do I do when I swing a not as great as I know I'm capable of. But just to kind of summarize and what happened after this, you know, we delivered kind of the analysis to Dana. Dana was able to turn it into coach speak for Bryson, and then, you know, that was on Wednesday before he he went out to play his practice round. And Paul was with him throughout that practice round. And Paul and Dana, obviously. And he hit it great. I mean, what was Wednesday and Thursday like, you know, comparison to Houston?
Yeah, so I think it was neat because, you know, Bryson's a curious cat, and he's obviously thinking in a level that most tour players don't. So I think all tour players want to know that they're doing something correctly, and my job is to be as forthright as possible with the information I have at hand. So, and like I said, Jihei, like this is most likely, in my opinion, obviously, because of the result, it's kind of set in stone that this is a direction that golf coaching is going to go. And I'm not saying like every teacher watching this needs to follow suit, but I think to some capacity, it's probably a smart thing to do, because it takes the guesswork out. So that kind of displayed itself on the practice rounds and in the golf tournament. So it didn't mean that there weren't adjustments that needed to be made, but it was more or less like, all right, I'm in the practice round. This is a shot shape that I'm trying to commit to, and tour players are trying to commit to hitting a shot. And these are the necessary feels that I'm going to associate to that ball flight. And do they actually fall into what I'm seeing? So my big replay with, doesn't matter if you're a junior player or a tour professional, if you can't commit to what you're seeing, you can't actually execute the shot you're trying to hit. So with Bryson having the right data set, and obviously this is a large sample size that was compressed. I called it kind of like a jet engine. You get all this information and you coalesce it into a small component that you can deliver. That allowed Bryson to play more freely, hit the appropriate shots that he wants to hit. Doesn't mean that he's not going to hit an outlying bad one. Golf is like that, and you're going to do that. But it allowed him to make the right necessary changes on the next shot so that he can perform at a higher level. So once again, that's the thing that is most inherent to myself as a coach, is I want to be able to have better information for those players to use so that they can go out and play and keep it simple.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key is, you know, of course, information is great, but I think it gave him the confidence, you know, having the data to back up what he was trying to achieve, what you guys are trying to achieve in the swing, kind of gave him this confidence that he needed to go out there and perform. And Thursday, I know overall, if you average out his fairways hit, I think it's something like 45% for the week. But that Thursday, he hit 86% of fairways and 83% of greens. Just phenomenal thinking about how far he was hitting the ball. But yeah, I think that process of, you know, data-driven decision making really helped with the confidence part of it. All right, going to the next part. So the next part, I think this is almost like a quest that like has been like a never-ending quest for Bryson, has been like, hey, I shot 58 last year at Greenbrier. If I can swing like that, if I can figure out how to swing like that every single time, then I'll win every tournament. So, you know, the second question was, what do I do differently versus my best swings? You know, I know I'm capable of shooting 58 with my swing, hitting it perfectly every single time I step up. I just need to know, if I get off, if I hit it offline, what happens in the swing so that I can always come back to it, come back to the good swing. So from Wednesday and Thursday, we captured those swings. We have that in our database for Bryson. And Thursday during the tournament days, what we were doing was basically providing you guys with anything that is not the same as the Wednesday, Thursday morning swings, right? And this is again just a glimpse of all of the rows and columns of data we were collecting. But basically, with Dana, we were communicating live. Hey, his Friday morning warm-up session was this different in these aspects. And yeah, so Dana, talk us through what you were like, the information you were digesting and what you were seeing in the data.
Yeah, so this is obviously after 2 lattes. So I'll just throw that out there right now. I got to throw some humor at everybody. But so yeah, it was interesting to see. Like I said, we're all human beings, and we're trying to put our best foot forward. And in Bryson's case, and this is something to understand, is that so obviously we're dealing with one of the best players in the world, if not the best, especially this year, displaying in majors. And so there's been a lot of close, calls in majors, like potentially could have won the Masters. My opinion, should have if he had a foresight on the green, but it's another conversation. And obviously at the PGA. And so, I'm looking at this going like, all right, when we start seeing moves or trends, okay, and moves or trends could be like, how was how'd you sleep? How did you warm up? How are you moving for the day? Every golfer is kind of evolving or making slight compensations throughout the time of day. And so it's interesting to kind of see that trend take place. So in Bryson's case, we can see like, oh, in the warm up, this piece is trending in a certain direction, or you started in this direction. So then we have to make an area of influence. And I think this is why we need a big data set. And I'm not trying to sell everybody on this, but I'm just saying from this experience, having a large data set day to day to day, you can see those trends and go, hey, you know what? My player is moving in this direction. I can be forthright and just say it instead of, sit back, because this is unfortunately kind of how I operate. I'm not going to tell you bad information. So sometimes us coaches get caught because we don't want to be subjective. We want to actually give you the right information. And this actually did it. And that's why, Paul and I were, going back and forth, looking at each swing, going, okay, like this point's actually moving in this direction. And then we're able to say, look, like you have to go back to this data set, whether it be like your setup needs to have 3 degrees more right bend, because we're seeing this trend start to move this way. So it's really helpful, especially with a high level athlete, because they can make those adjustments. Obviously, Bryson's probably the best at it. He can make adjustments on the fly because, he's trying to be reactive to the target. And I think also, interesting enough, like the range with the wind and the temperature changes. So like, I think it was Saturday or Sunday, the wind was off the left on the range. So starting to see things start to change was huge as far as looking at this in the data.
Yeah. So here are just 2 screenshots of his right miss. Sorry, on the left is it was his perfect drive with I think something like negative 3.5 spin axis. And then on the right was one of his push misses, both from the US Open. And you can see these were kind of the tiles that we always had up for Bryson for the rest of the week. Starting from the right to left, chest bend at address, as we talked about, pelvis sway at top, and then sway gap at top. So you guys are basically checking for these three variables on every swing to make sure he was staying in the range that was optimal for him.
Yeah.
I guess one point I want to make is these are just optimal numbers for his driver. It'll be different for his irons. It'll be different for another player. Obviously, the trick is going through the work in order to establish what the optimal ranges are for the variables that tend to change. And another point I want to make is looking at his data, it was actually remarkable how tight his movement dispersions are for everything that we measure, except for some of these that were offline, like that have a tendency to get out of line. So, it was really, really just fascinating to look at an athlete that can move that consistently. But yeah, these are two swings that we can show as examples of, when he has enough sway gap at top versus, getting too stacked on top of the pelvis versus the chest.
Yeah. And Gia, if you don't mind, I think this is the big part, and I think you kind of nailed it. Every player has, their own fingerprint, if you want to call it that. I know that's a little cliche, but they have their own authentic way that they swing a golf club. And so when they go to work with a new teacher, they're embarking on potentially either a change in the good direction or a change in the bad direction. So, my recommendation for every tour player is, do go out and get a big data set. This is how I see the future of golf going. And I'm obviously not trying to discount myself, but I think it's important to maybe get a big data set of what you currently are doing and see if there is a relatability of some of your outlying misses to your best shot. And in doing that, then you can make a better educated choice whether or not you need to go in a direction with, a different level of coaching, or is the level of coaching that you're using right now actually working for you? And, because I think you don't want to make hastily bad choices because maybe the coach you're using right now is exceptional, but you just maybe need maybe more of a refined answer in what you're doing. So I think it helps everybody instead of people bouncing around, which tends to be the case on every subsect of golfer. So that's the part I really like, is it allows us as coaches to be coaches again, instead of us, subjectively guessing or fitting people into certain patterns, which is inherently where the industry has, been the last 15 years. People tend to put people in preference models, like, oh, this will make you have better control over the ball. But then at the end of the day, you're like, okay, yeah, maybe, but drag that out, it actually isn't the case. And my goal is that, players like Bryson are winning, time and time again. He's certainly capable to do that week in and week out. How do we make that happen?
Yeah. By the way, we've got some questions that I want to throw at you. But one thing that I wanted to ask was, one could say, I wouldn't, but some might say that you took a little bit of risk in throwing this new process or system on a player getting ready for the US Open. I mean, what would you say to that? And kind of related to it is, a lot of people think Bryson is a super technical player, but he's actually a great field player. So, how did you decide this was a good idea for
Yeah,
Bryson?
I so obviously I have more confidence in Bryson as a golfer and as a player than what people might think. So I know he can handle this because he's getting better information. So me just standing there with video and guessing is not acceptable. Even though I know what he's looking for and I have faith in his ability, giving better information, like we're not giving him 200 data points, we're narrowing down those data points. So the risk actually goes down because, it makes me a better, more effective coach and communicator. That's my goal. So, and my other goal is that everybody around him kind of feeds off that. And that's obviously the best outcome. And if that happens weekly at every tournament, then that's kind of the environment that I want to see. And obviously, like that week, we kind of saw it, we kind of felt it. And I had a very good feeling on Thursday that it was going to be a pretty decent week for him. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. But if I don't like living in ambiguity, I think that's a dangerous place to be. And that tends, to be fair, that tends to be cultural on the PGA Tour at times. I'm going to go find it, or I'm a good artist of playing golf, so I just think that's a little bit dangerous at times, and I think people kind of brush that off and accept it too much.
Yeah. Related to that, what's the, let me figure out the right way to ask this question. Were you surprised by anything in the data, or were there things that were specifically, you had a suspicion about that the data validated in a way that you hadn't been able to before, specific to Bryson or any other tour player that you work with?
Yeah. So what's interesting is, like, I know the outcome, right? So we know the outcome on a right shot is going to be, I'll use layman's terms, a late shallowing type thing. So, I think that's, the arm kind of comes out, stand up, back up, boom, goes to the right. But like, okay, well, what exactly is causing that? I at his speed, you can't control P5, lead arm parallel. Like, that's an afterthought. And I've been saying for a while, like, that's the end of the golf swing. The end of the golf swing is lead arm parallel, especially at, 127 to 129 mile per hour club head speed. So if you're trying to control that narrative there, by the way, Bryson's going to beat you. It just is what it is. And so, so we see in major championships players like that. Wherever we look at Rory, we see, another high speed player. It's kind of the same narrative. Xander Schauffele, same narrative. So we're seeing these narratives. So if you're downstream from lead arm parallel trying to control those variables at a driver, you're probably not going to win. So that being said, those afterthoughts that you see on 2D, like, what are those things that are adding up to that, and to how much tolerance is that? You can't see 2 degrees or 3 degrees with your naked eye. So that's the advantage of getting such a large database of outcomes and numbers, that it kind of clarifies, oh, well, this is where this needs to be. This is what this feels like. And we got to keep that tolerance tight.
Yeah, that's a really, really good perspective on it. Okay, so Frank wanted to know, are there any plans to use AI to analyze the data to recognize specific causes for specific misses? So I waited until we presented this to answer this question. I'm not going to give anything away, but we're able to do all this analysis on the back end, and we are on the path, right? We're on the path to making this process less manual and more automated. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. There's a lot coming here, and that's the vision that Foresight Sports and Sportsbox had from the beginning when we got together and decided to, join our products. So thank you for the question. Jeff Fisher wanted to know, what other factors cause the variations in chest bend? And this is interesting. And there's another question from Craig Jacobs. There's actually one of the biggest changes in his swing data, biggest variability, was in his chest bend at address, which seems, out of character for a elite player. I'll mention this little bit of background, and then I'll hand it over to Dana. We saw in his Thursday warm-up, which was in the afternoon, where his body was already warmed up, that his chest bend was in his optimal range, slightly lower on the spectrum, like 30, what's it called, 33, 34. And then on Friday, when he teed off at like 7:20, his chest bend was more hunched over. So there's a little bit of context there in that he tends to be more opened up, I guess, when he's warmed up in his body and, ready to go versus like, when it's super early in the morning. But yeah, Dana, maybe that's some other pattern or context you can provide there.
Yeah, I think the two big correlation ones was the obviously the chest bend, and then it actually it let me build kind of a thing going into looking at how much knee flex, which knee, so there's a lot of stuff you can do, but distance from the ball, like when that chest bend changes, what do the arms do? So how much room does he have? And so all those things kind of go together. So it gave me kind of a correlation plot for, his address with his driver. So yeah, I think not to go down the rabbit hole too much, but all those things add up. And it allowed us to subtract back to, oh, well, this chest bend number is kind of, the top of the pyramid that we're looking at, and everything under that downstream is foundational relative to that. So if we can get to that number, if legs are too straight, what's going to happen? Your chest is going to bend. Stand too close to it, what's going to happen? Elbows pull apart. So like all these things start kind of adding up. So
yeah. And then the partnership with Foresight show which numbers are correlated, or would we need to do this type of analysis on our own? Again, there are more features coming that will be built on top of the combined data set. Currently, I should say though, you're just looking at the pieces of data together in the same place, not a lot of insights or calculated correlations being shown in the product itself currently. But get with us if you're working with elite players and you'd like to do this level of deep analysis and data collection. We are looking at beta testing with a few other players. So I'll leave that at that. How much does the chest bend influence tempo? Bernard wanted to know.
That's a good question. Not something I look at because it was with driver, he is just going full. He's going after it. So, it's not something we really looked at unless we start looking at more of his shorter irons, which are a little more feel based. But that's a very good question. So when we start looking at the shorter irons and the wedges and things like that, that might be something that I looked at. But as far as that's concerned, no, didn't look at that one. It's in the data, but
yeah, it is
not something we looked at.
Will be interesting to look at the correlation on the back end, if those two things are correlated or not. Axel wanted to know, are the ranges, I assume in the app, we do have pro database ranges for everything we track. Are the ranges being measured based on a prototype swing, or are they customized by the coach? So I'll answer that question. In the product, if you record a swing and look at the trackers, we show you the high and low range for each of the trackers at each key position. Those ranges are based on a Tour Pro database. We have a male Tour Pro driver and iron database. So if you've selected, an iron for your recording, then we're comparing you to a iron database and driver, and female Tour database as well. So if you are logged in as a female player or male player, that'll have different databases that we're comparing against. That said, if you do have a coach that you're connected to on Sportsbox, they have the ability to customize a range that's ideal for you. So we do recommend that you work with a coach, identify the things that you want to work on, just like, Dana did with Bryson. And, Dana would never look at the average Tour Pro database for Bryson for any of these numbers. They're very specific to Bryson that he would set up for him in the app. So that's what I'll say about that. I know there was one question about not related to the kind of the data work that we did, What was Bryson thinking going into the bunker shot? If you have
Oh,
any, if you can share any insights on like what was going through his mind, how he was able to execute, I'm sure people would enjoy learning about that.
yeah, there's really like I would say there's two things. So first and foremost, like, okay, what's the best shot that I'm most comfortable with? And this is something I've done thousands of times. So the his mindset did not go into um, I have to do something special here. It was I'm just going to hit one of those shots that it's called to do. So I think we get caught if you were playing into I need to do something that I haven't done before. I need to control some variables, and for him, it's like no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take the gap wedge, walk in, and I'm going to hit a certain carry pace of this shot, and I'm just going to execute it, in which he did. Um, and then the other side of it is like, um, having a clear picture of what the shot needs to look like, and a little bit of like, look what I can do. So there's a little hand in hand in that as well, and executed it great. Absolutely, what needed to be done, and I think this is important to understand because especially in the high level competition, like you need to be able to operate on the proper side of your brain where it's very automatic and that you're able to stay within your process. You're able to not get ahead of yourself, not over try. Like all those things are happening on the proper side of the brain instead of the improper side of your brain. Um, so like that's why I think going back to this whole data conversation, people think of it as being a bad thing because it is in the wrong side of your brain. But what you're actually doing is you're satisfying your brain so that you can be competitive, and you can't be caught in between. If you have any ounce of lack of commitment, lack of picture, um, then the wrong side of your brain starts to take over, and that's the dangerous part. Um, and I think that's where golfers need to understand at every level. It's like, okay, why do you practice? Okay, you practice because you're trying to improve technique, improve feel, execute outcome. And so that's what's important. I think we live in a day and age now where everything is data driven. And what does that really mean? Like data driven means that you get better educated answers. It's not a dangerous thing. I know it's like, oh, they're selling your data. Like, what does that mean? Well, they're trying to find out what you like. So, in the golf side of things, we're trying to find out what your best self is, and that's what the data is. The data is authentically finding out what your best self is, and if it's not there, let's get you there, and let's get you there quicker than later. And that's kind of the big message for today.
A great one to end on. Dana, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and your insights. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to more great things from your players for the rest of the season.
Thank
Thanks
you very
everybody for
much.
joining, and we'll see you again soon.